Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch by Alice Hegan Rice. Chapter 1. Mrs. Wiggs' Philosophy. In the mud and scum of things, something always sings. My, but it's nice and cold this morning. The thermometers done fell up to 0. Mrs. Wiggs made the statement as cheerfully as if her elbows were not sticking out through her boy's coat that she wore, or her teeth not chattering in her head like a pair of castanets. But then Mrs. Wiggs was a philosopher, and the sum and substance of her philosophy lay in keeping the dust off her rose-colored spectacles. When Mr. Wiggs traveled to eternity by the alcohol route, she buried his faults with him, and for want of better virtues to extol, she always laid stress on the fine hand he wrote. It was the same way when their little country home burned, and she had to come to the city to seek work. Her one comment was, "Thank God it was the pig instead of the baby that got burned." So this bleak morning in December she pinned the bedclothes around the children and made them sit up close to the stove while she pasted brown paper over the broken window pane and made sprightly comments on the change in the weather. The Wiggses lived in the Cabbage Patch. It was not a real cabbage patch, but a strange neighborhood where ramshackled cottages played hopscotch over the railroad tracks. There were no streets, so when a new house was built, the owner faced it any way his fancy prompted. Mr. Bagsby's grocery, it is true, conformed to convention and presented a solid front to the railroad track, but Miss Hazy's cottage shied off sideways into the Wigses' yard, as if it were afraid of the big freight trains that went thundering past so many times a day, and Mrs. Schultz's front room looked directly into the Ecorn's kitchen. The latter was not a bad arrangement, however, for Mrs. Schultz had been confined to her bed for 10 years, and her sole interest in life consisted in watching what took place in her neighbor's family. The Wigses' house was the most imposing in the neighborhood. This was probably due to the fact that it had 2 front doors and a tin roof. One door was nailed up, and the other opened outdoors. But you would never guess it from the street. When the country house burned, one door had been saved, and Mrs. Wiggs and the boys brought it to the new home and skillfully placed it at the front end of the side porch. But the roof gave the house its chief distinction. It was the only tin roof in the Cabbage Patch. Jim and Billy had made it of old cans, which they picked up on the commons. Jim was 15 and head of the family. His shoulders were those of a man and were bent with work, but his body dwindled away to a pair of thin legs that seemed incapable of supporting the burden imposed upon him. In his anxious eyes was the look of a breadwinner who had begun to struggle too soon. Life had been a tragedy to Jim. The tragedy that comes when a child's sensitive soul is forced to meet the responsibilities of manhood, yet lacks the wisdom that only experience can bring. Billy Wiggs was differently constituted. Responsibilities rested upon him as lightly as freckles on his nose. When occasion or his mother demanded, he worked to good purpose, with a tenacity that argued well for his future success. But for the most part he played and fought and got into trouble with the aptitude characteristic of the average small boy. It was Mrs. Wiggs' boast that her 3 little girls had geography names. First came Asia, then Australia. When the last baby arrived, Billy had stood looking down at the small bundle and asked anxiously, "Are you going to have it for a boy or a girl, Ma?" Mrs. Wiggs had answered, "A girl, Billy, and her name's Europeana." On this particular Sunday morning, Mrs. Wiggs bustled about the kitchen in usual haste. "I am gonna to make you all some nice Irish potato soup for dinner," she said, as she came in from the parlor where she kept her potatoes and onions. "The boys'll be in soon, and we'll have to hurry and get through 'fore the children begin comin' to Sunday school." For many years Sunday afternoon had been a trying time in the neighborhood, so Mrs. Wiggs had organized a Sunday school class at which she presided. "If they don't come Chris and Pratt already," said Asia from her post by the stove, "I bet they've had their dinner and just come early to get some of ours." "Why, Asia," exclaimed Mrs. Wiggs, "that ain't hospital. And Chris with one leg too. 'Tain't no trouble at all. All I got to do is to put a little more water in the soup, and me and Jim won't take but one piece of bread." When Jim and Billy came in, they found their places at the table taken, so they sat on the floor and drank their soup out of teacups. "Gee," said Billy, after the third helping, "I've drunken so much that when I swallers a piece of bread, I can hear it splash." "Well, you boys get up now, and go out and bring me a couple of planks to put across the chairs for the children to sit on." By 2 o'clock that Sunday school had begun. Every seat in the kitchen available and otherwise was occupied. The boys sat in the windows and on the table, and the girls squeezed together on the impoverished benches. Mrs. Wiggs stood before them with dilapidated hymn book in her hand. "Now you all must hush talkin', so we can all sing a hymn. I'll read it over. Then we'll all sing it together. When upon life's billows you are tempest-tossed, when you are discouraged, thinkin' all is lost, count your many blessin's, name 'em one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord hath done." Clear and strong rose the childish voices in the different keys, and regardless of time, but with a genuine enthusiasm that all in itself a blessing. When they had sung through 3 stanzas, Mrs. Wiggs began the lesson. "What did we study 'bout last Sunday?" she asked. No response save a smothered giggle from 2 of the little girls. "Don't you all remember what the Lord give Moses up on the mountain?" A hand went up in the corner, and an eager voice cried, "Yes'm, I knows. Lord gave Moses 10 thalers, and he duveled 'em." Before Miss Wiggs could enter into an argument concerning this new version of the sacred history, she was hit in the eye with a paper wad. It was aimed at Billy, but when he dodged, she became the victim. This caused some delay, for she had to bathe the injured member, and during the interval the Sunday school became riotous. "Miss Wiggs, make Tommy stop tappin' tobaccer juice in my hat." "Miss Wiggs, I know who hit you." "Teacher, can I get a drink?" It was not until Mrs. Wiggs, with a stocking tied over her eye, emerged from the bedroom and again took command, that order was restored. "Where is Bethlehem?" she began, reading from an old lesson paper. "You can search me," promptly answered Chris. She ignored his remark and passed to the next, who said, half doubtfully, "Ain't it in Alabama?" "No, it's in the Holy Land," she said. A sudden commotion arose in the back of the room. Billy, by a series of skillful maneuvers, had succeeded in removing the chair that held one of the planks, and a cascade of small indignant girls were tobogganing sideways down the incline. A fight was imminent, but before any further trouble occurred, Mrs. Wiggs locked Billy in the bedroom and became mistress of the situation. "What I think you children need is a talk about fussin' and fightin'. There ain't no use in me teachin' what they done thousands of years ago when you ain't got manners enough to listen at what I was sayin'. I recollect one time during the war, when the soldiers was lying round the camp, trying thy best to keep from freezing to death, a preacher came along to hold a service. And when he got up to preach, he says, "Friends," says he, "my text is chilblains. They ain't no use a preachin' religion to men whose whole thought is to set on their feet. Now, you fellows get some soft soaps and pour it in your shoes, and just keep them shoes on till your feet gets well, and the next time I come round, your minds'll be better prepared to receive the word of the Lord." Now, that's the way I feel about this here Sunday school. First and foremost, I'm going to learn you all manners. Just one thought I want you to take away, and that is, it's sinful to fuss. Ma uses to say livin' was like quiltin'. You orter keep the pieces and do away with the scraps. Now, what do I want you to remember? Don't fuss, came the prompt answer. That's right. Now we'll all sing Pull for the Shore. When the windows had ceased to rattle from the vibrations of the lusty chorus, Mrs. Wiggs lifted her hands for silence. "O Lord," she prayed earnestly, "help these here children to be good and kind to each other and to their ma's and their pa's. Make 'em thankful for whatever they've got, even if it ain't but a little. Show us all how to live like you want us to live, and praise God from whom all blessings flow. Amen." As the last youngster scampered out of the yard, Mrs. Wiggs turned to the window where Jim was standing. He had taken no part in the singing and was silent and preoccupied. "Jim," said his mother, trying to look him into his face, "you never had on your overcoat when you come in. You ain't going and sold it?" "Yes," said the boy heavily, "but 'tain't 'nough for the rent. I got to figure it out some other way." Mrs. Wiggs put her arm about his shoulder, and together they looked out across the dreary commons. "Don't you worry so, Jimmy," she said. "Maybe I can get work tomorrow, or you'll get a raise or something. There'll be some way." Little she guessed what the way was to be. 2. Ways and Means. Ah, well may the children weep before you. They are weary ere they run. They have never seen the sunshine, nor the glory which is brighter than the sun. The cold wave that was ushered in that December morning was the beginning of a long series of days that vied with each other as to which could induce the mercury to drop the lowest. The descent of the temperature seemed to have a like effect on the barrel of potatoes and the load of coal in the Wiggs's parlor. Mrs. Wiggs' untiring efforts to find employment had met with no success, and Jim's exertions were redoubled. Day by day his scanty earnings became less sufficient to meet the demands of the hungry family. On Christmas Eve they sat near the stove, after the little ones had gone to bed, and discussed the situation. The wind hurled itself against the house in a very frenzy of rage, shaking the icicles from the window ledge and hissing through the patched panes. The snow that sifted in through the loose sash lay unmelted on the sill. Jim had a piece of old carpet about him, and coughed with almost every breath. Mrs. Wiggs' head was in her hands, and her tears had trickled through her crooked fingers, hissed as they fell on the stove. It was the first time Jim had ever seen her give up. "Seems like we'll have to ask for help, Jim," she said. "I can't ask for credit at Mr. Bagsby's. Seems like I'd never have the courage to pull a debt. What do you think? I guess it looks like maybe we'll have to apply to the organization." Jim's eyes flashed. "Not yet, Ma," he said firmly. "It'd be with us like it was with the Hornsbys. They didn't have nothing to eat, and they went to the organization, and the man asked 'em if they had a bed or a table, and when they said yes, he said, 'Well, why don't you sell 'em?' No, Ma. As long as we've got coal, I'll get the victuals some way." He had to pause, for a violent attack of coughing shook him from head to foot. "I think I can get a night job next week. One of the market men comes in from the country every night to get an early start next morning, and he asked me if I'd sleep in his wagon from 3 to 6 and keep his vegetables from being stolen. That'd give me time to get home and get breakfast and be down to the factory by 7. "But, Jimmy boy," cried his mother, her voice quivering with anxiety, "you never could stand it night and day too." "No, I'll watch the wagon, and A knock on the parlor door interrupted her. She hastily dried her eyes and smoothed her hair. Jim went to the door. "I've a Christmas basket for you," cried a cheery voice. "Is this Christmas?" Jim asked dully. The girl in the doorway laughed. She was tall and slender, but Jim could only see a pair of sparkling eyes between the brim of the hat and her high fur collar. It was nice to hear her laugh, though. It made things seem warmer somehow. The man behind her deposited a large basket on the doorstep. "It's from the church," she explained. "A crowd of us are out in the bus distributing baskets." "Well, how'd you ever happen to come here?" cried Mrs. Wiggs, who had come to the door. "There is one for each of the mission school's family. Just a little Christmas greeting, you know." Mrs. Wiggs' spirits were rising every minute. "That certainly is kind and thoughtful-like," she said. "Won't you—" Then she hesitated. The room she had just left was not in a condition to receive guests, but Mrs. Wiggs was a Kentuckian. "Come right in and get warm," she said cordially. "The stove's died down some, but you could get thawed out." "No, thank you, I can't come in," said the young lady with a side glance at Jim, who was leaning against the door. "Have you plenty of coal?" she asked in an undertone. "Oh, yes'm, thank you," said Mrs. Wiggs, smiling reassuringly. Her tone might have been less confident but for Jim's warning glance. Every fibre of his sensitive nature shrank from asking help. The girl was puzzled. She noticed the stamp of poverty on everything inside except the bright face of the little woman before her. "Well," she said doubtfully, "if you ever want to come to see me, ask for Miss Lucy Olcott at Terrace Park. Good night and Happy Christmas." She was gone, and the doorway looked very black and lonesome in consequence, but there was the big basket to prove that she was not merely an apparition, and it took both Jim and his mother to carry it into the house. Sitting on the floor, they unpacked it. There were vegetables and oatmeal and fruit, and even tea and coffee. But the surprise was at the very bottom, a big turkey, looking so comical, with its legs stuck in his body, that Jim laughed outright. "It's the first turkey that's been in this house for many a day," said Mrs. Wiggs delightedly, as she pinched the fat fowl. "I specs your Apenna'll be skeered of it. It's so big. My, but we'll have a good dinner tomorrow. I'll get Miss Hazy and Chris to come over and spend the day, and I'll carry a plate over to Mrs. Schultz and take a little of this here tea to old Mrs. Lawson." The cloud had turned inside out for Mrs. Wiggs, and only the silver lining was visible. Jim was doing a sum on the brown paper, and came over the basket, and presently he looked up and said slowly, "Ma, I guess we can't have the turkey this year. I can sell it for $1.75, and that would buy a hog meat for a good while." Mrs. Wiggs' face fell, and she twisted her apron string in silence. She had pictured the joy of a real Christmas dinner, the first the young children had seen, and she had already thought of half a dozen neighbors to whom she wanted to send a little snack. But one look at Jim's anxious face recalled their circumstances. "Of course we'll sell it," she said brightly. "You have got the longest head for a boy. We'll sell it in the morning and buy sausage for dinner, and I'll cook some of these here nice vegetables and put an orange and some candy in each plate, and the children'll have known nothing 'bout it. Besides," she added, "if you ain't never et turkey meat, you don't know how good it is." But in spite of her philosophy, after Jim had gone to bed, she slipped over and took one more look at the turkey. "I think I wouldn't have minded so much," she said wistfully, "if they hadn't sent that cranberry too." For 10 days the basket of provisions and extra money made by Jim's night work and Mrs. Wiggins' washing supplied the demand of the family, and by the end of January the clouds had gathered thicker than before. Mrs. Wiggs' heart was heavy one night as she tramped home through the snow after a hard day's work. The rent was due, the coal was out, and only a few potatoes were left in the barrel. But these were mere shadows compared to Jim's illness. He had been too sick to go to the factory that morning, and she dared not think what changes the day may have brought. As she lifted the latch of her rickety door, the sobbing of a child greeted her. It was little Europeana, crying for food. For 3 days there had been no bread in the house, and a scanty supply of potatoes and beans had been their only nourishment. Mrs. Wiggs hastened to where Jim lay on a cot in the corner. His cheeks were flushed, and his thin, nervous fingers picked at the old shawl that covered him. "Jim," she said, kneeling beside him and pressing his hot hands to her cheek. "Jim, darlin', let me go for the doctor. You're worsen than you were this morning, and I'm so skeered." Her voice broke into a sob. Jim tried to put his arms round her, but something hurt him in his chest when he moved, so he patted her hand instead. "Never mind, Ma," he said, his breath coming short. "We ain't got no money to buy the medicine, even if the doctor did come. You go get some supper now. And, Ma, don't worry. I'm going to take care of you all. Only, he added wearily, I guess I can't sleep in the wagon tonight." Slowly the hours passed until midnight. Mrs. Wiggs had pulled Jim's cot close to the stove and applied vigorous measures to relieve him. Her efforts were unceasing, and one after another the homely country remedies were faithfully administered. At 12 o'clock he grew restless. "Seems like I'm hot. Then again I'm cold," he said, speaking with difficulty. "Could you find a little something more to put over me, Ma?" Mrs. Wiggs got up and went towards the bed. The 3 little girls lay huddled under one old quilt, their faces pale and sunken. She turned away abruptly and looked towards the corner where Billy slept on a pallet. The blankets on his bed were insufficient even for him. She put her hand over her face, and for a moment dry sobs convulsed her. The hardest grief is often that which leaves no trace. When she went back to the stove, she had a smile ready for the sick boy. "Here's the very thing," she said. "It's my dress skirt. I don't need it a mite. Sittin' up here so close to the fire, see how nice it tucks in all round." For a while he lay silent and then said, "Ma, you are awake?" "Yes, Jim." "Well, I've been thinking it over. If I ain't better in the morning, I guess," the words came reluctantly, "I guess you'd better go see the Christmas lady. I wouldn't mind her knowin' so much. 'Twon't be for long nohow, 'cause I can take keer of you all soon as I can get up." The talking brought on severe coughing, and he sank back exhausted. "Can't you go to sleep, honey?" asked his mother. "No, it's them old wheels," he said fretfully. "Them wheels at the factory. When I get to sleep, they keep on waking me up." Mrs. Wiggs' hands were rough and knotted, but love taught them to be gentle as she smoothed his hot head. "Want me to tell you about the country, Jim?" Since he was a little boy, he had loved to hear her old home in the valley. His dim recollection of it all formed his one conception of heaven. "Yes, Ma. Maybe it will make me forget the wheels," he said. "Well," she began, putting her head beside his on the pillow, so he could not watch her face. "It was all just like a big front yard without no fences, and the flowers didn't belong to folks like they do over on the avenue. They was God's, and you was welcome to all you could pull, and there 'twas trees where you could climb up and get big red apples, Jim. And when the frost had come, there'd be persimmons that you'd just melt in your mouth, and you could look way off 'cross the meaders and see the trees a-wavin' in the sunshine, and up over your head the birds 'ud be singin' like they was never goin' to stop, and your pa and me, you'd take you at the harvest time, and you'd play on the haystacks. And I can remember just how you looked, Jim, a fat little boy with red cheeks a-laughin' all the time." Mrs. Wiggs could tell no more, but the old memories were too much for her. Jim scarcely knew when she stopped. His eyes were half closed, and a sweet drowsiness was upon him. "It's nice and warm in the sunshine," he murmured. "The meteors on trees laughin' all the time. Birds singin', singin', singin'." Then Jim began to sing too softly, and the sorrow that had not come with years left his tired face, and he fearlessly drifted away into the shadowy valley where his lost childhood lay.